So before we go any further, I just wanted to thank Caroline and Brittany. They put all these materials together for you in this grazing manual. And it's a monumental job to get all that copied and hole punched and put into these binders. Takes a lot longer than you would think. So let's give them a hand. Okay, this talk that I'm giving now is, and Todd's was kind of a good lead into this, is talking about rejuvenating rundown pastures. A lot of you are going to be starting right here. You're going to come back to a farm that was in the family that somebody else has been taking care of or not taking care of. Maybe you bought a small acreage or a small farm that's been kind of abused for a number of years, and you're going to have to do something to rejuvenate that farm. And that's kind of what this talk is about, is kind of thinking about how you're going to do that. As Todd mentioned, the older I get, the less I like to recommend a complete renovation where you spray everything out and kill it and start over again. I would much rather see you take what you have and start there and kind of improve that through management. And that doesn't happen overnight, so you're going to have to be patient. To make real substantial changes through management, I mean, it's going to take you 3 or 5 years to see the fruits of that labor. So it's important that you kind of get a plan together for renovation. Think about where you want to be and then implement that plan and stay the course. And that's important, to have that ability and persistence to keep that plan moving forward. So renovation doesn't always mean reseeding per se. A lot of times it's changing how you're doing things or other things within the system that we're going to talk about to make changes over time in those pastures. A lot of people are starting right here. This is Greg Brand, and Greg Brand is going to have a field day in October. It's on our web page under events. If you haven't been to one of his field days, it's worth the trip down to go to it. He's near Scottsville in a little town called Adolphus. And this particular time, I always help Greg with the field day, and we were talking about what to do with a pasture like this. And many of you may have this. Everybody probably knows what this is. We see this time of the year, right? Broom sage in your pastures. I hope you don't all have it, but most of us probably have some of it. We're talking about trying to think about how do we manage that. And a lot of times people say, well, you just need to start over. And I'm not sure that's the right answer. If you read the Cow Country News, this October issue will have an article dealing with broom sage management in pastures. So when you get this farm that's all grown up, it's got woody stuff growing on it, it's got brambles, and it's got Sericea lespedeza and broom straw, and you think, there's nothing there. The first thing you really need to do is just clip those pastures and see what's there. And a lot of times the pastures will be so grown up that they'll be up to the tractor hood in brambles and other things, and Johnson grass, and you just got to go slow and clip it. And when you do that, what you're probably going to figure out is there's more stuff underneath all that mess than you thought there was. And so doing that 2 or 3 times that first year, and usually we don't clip 3 times in a year, but doing 2 or 3 times that first year really starts to let you see what's there. And it's going to help control some of those weedy things that we find in the pastures without having to invest in a herbicide. Remember, when we spray a herbicide, we kill all the broadleaf plants, just not the target weed species. And then just kind of assess what you have after that first year. And we'll talk about the next step in a second. Try to time your clipping to limit weed seed production. And a good example is broom sage. So I like to clip pastures that have a lot of broom sage the last week of August. When I do that, the plant has not gone to seed yet, but the growing point where the seed head is has been elevated, so I can clip it, knock it back, and I don't have that seed production. You can do the same thing with other weed species in your pastures, and you want to do that before they make a billion seeds, right? Because if you're clipping after it makes a billion seeds, what are you doing? you're just spreading that seed out all over the pasture, right? So timely clipping is important. And that will vary from weed species to weed species. So the second step that I had was control problem weeds. Sometimes you're going to have weeds that you need to use a little herbicide on. And if you have that, then time it so that you're controlling that weed. We always, well, first we need to define what a weed is in a pasture, right? So too often we define it like a row crop guy. So a row crop guy would define a weed in a cornfield as something that's not corn. That's not necessarily true in a pasture, right? We've got lots of things that grow in pastures that we didn't plant, and they're not necessarily weeds, they're forbs. If the animal's grazing it, then it's not really a weed in that pasture. Naturally, we wouldn't want all weedy forbs in a pasture, but if you try to control every weed that we have in a pasture, you're going to lose your mind and go broke. So we're going to have to live with a few of these weedy forbs that animals can eat. We often view weeds as the problem, but really they're kind of a symptom rather than a problem itself. So where does a weed grow? A weed grows where we've got a hole in the sod, right? So the good Lord doesn't leave ground uncovered very long, unless you've got 21 horses on it. I don't know what group that was. But where there's a hole in that sod, something's going to grow there. And a lot of times it'll be something we don't want. So the best defense that we can have against weeds is not using a bunch of herbicides, but rather having something growing in those holes that we want. And that's really important. So when we think about weed control, we need to think about it kind of from an integrated approach. We need to think about why is that weed there? Ask ourselves, why is that weed there? Do I have bad grazing management? Is my soil fertility not where it needs to be? Did I choose the wrong forage species? Am I trying to make Timothy grow in western Kentucky where it has no chance of being persistent in that pasture? How's my grazing management? You know, am I grazing too close and too frequently? Am I not rotating my pastures? And then the last part of the weed control would be the judicial use of herbicides. So herbicides are not evil, but they're a tool. But if that's the first thing that we reach for when we talk about weed control in pastures, it's kind of like a revolving door. So I get a weed in my pasture, I go to the co-op, I say, well, I've got this weed, and the co-op says, well, I've got this great herbicide, and we've got some great pasture herbicides. I'll come out and spray it for you. So they come out and they spray it, and it kills the weed dead, right? So what do we have when that weed's gone? A hole. What grows in a hole? More weeds. So it can be a revolving door. So we really need to think about weed control as a whole systems approach, not just using herbicides in that pasture. You have this in your book. It's Broadleaf Weeds of Kentucky by Dr. Green. And Dr. Green's done an excellent job with this. He's got nice color pictures. But more importantly, he's got the weeds on the back, and he's got what herbicides are appropriate for that weed, and then he's got when to apply that herbicide, which is critical. So we not only have to get the right herbicide, we've got to put it on at the right time to get good control of that weed. And if you need help identifying a weed or choosing a herbicide, go to your extension office. That's why we're here. Work with your local extension agent to make sure that you're using the right herbicide and timing that application correctly.
Is there an app to go to? They've got all these apps now that are weed identifiers.
Yeah, I'm sure.
40 of them. I didn't know if there was one. University of Missouri Extension's got one.
I use Tim Phillips. He's our grass breeder, and he's the best weed app that I have. But
the best one we found is called Picture This.
Yeah.
It's a $30 a year fee. A free one is iNaturalist that I use a lot. Missouri has one, but when I'm teaching students and things like that in our pasture evaluation program, we use the Picture This.
Yeah.
For what it's worth, iPhones do it for you. You don't need an app.
You just pull the picture down, and it opens it up with. I can't remember what program it is. Maybe.
You literally just open a picture of the plant in your gallery, and you click the little eye.
And they're good, but they're not perfect, right?
Yeah.
So.
Just searching through kind of a Google thing.
All right, so we're on step 3 now. So we clipped our pastures. We got a weed control program together, and now we need to really look towards fertility in our pastures. And it's just hard to have a productive pasture if you don't have some level of base soil fertility in your pasture. And that's really important. That's why we had Dr. Grove on the program talking about soils and why we did a soil sampling demonstration and hands-on out in the field. Getting a good soil test and then using those results from the soils lab to make decisions with. Do we have to have everything in the high range for our soil test? We don't. If we're in the medium range, we're doing pretty good. What we want to avoid being in is in the very low range and low range, because it's very hard to maintain improved forages in that pasture. Oftentimes when we see broom sage infested pastures, there's something that's not quite right with that soil fertility. It could be pH, it could be phosphorus, it could be potassium. But the only way to identify that is to get a soil test and kind of figure out what's wrong and then get that soil fertility back in balance. So again, we quantify generally phosphorus and potassium, not nitrogen. Nitrogen is very transient in the soil. Provides us a baseline, otherwise we're just guessing. And it's really important. When fertilizer prices got high a couple years ago, soil testing was really important, because you only want to be putting on exactly what you need. You don't want to be putting on a 19-19-19 if you don't need the phosphorus in it. And having that soil test allows you to really target those applications. And we've got a nice soil testing publication in your manual on how to take soil samples, and it's all those things Dr. Grove talked about. It's just reminding you that getting a good sample is really important. And this is it right here. It's a 1-page back and front. Apply lime if you need it, and Dr. Grove talked about this, but probably one of the biggest factors that limits forage production, not just in Kentucky, but the whole southeastern United States, is soil acidity. It does a couple things. It reduces nutrient availability, so everything else in the soil, calcium, magnesium, phosphorus, potassium, they all become less available to the plant when our soil pH is too low. And it also reduces nitrogen fixation in legumes. So it's just not that the soil is acidic, but it's doing other things in the soil that's negatively impacting plant growth. Liming neutralizes soil acidity, and it also supplies some calcium and magnesium. These are just general guidelines, but for most pastures, if you're between 6 and 6.4, you're in pretty good shape. Now, if you're wanting to grow alfalfa, you got soils that's going to support alfalfa, then you need to be in that 6.5 to 7 range. So step 4, implement rotational stocking. So it's not just doing one thing at a time. You kind of do these simultaneously, as you start to move through this process. But management and how we're managing that grazing, and Ray talked about forage plant growth, that's really important in renovating these pastures. And when you implement rotational stocking, you've got to go into it with the right attitude. Don't do it because Ray told you to do it, or Todd told you to do it, or I told you to do it. Do it because you want to do it. If you go into it and say, well, this is never going to work, chances of you being successful are pretty slim. You're going to have problems. You're going to have floods and droughts, and you're going to tear pastures up. You're going to graze some too long or not long enough. But if you've got that right attitude, you're going to kind of find your way around those roadblocks, and you're going to make mistakes, and it's okay to make mistakes as you're going along the way. Controlling grazing is key, and key to that is having water in the right places. That was a great presentation that Jeff Lemcooler gave and Todd gave about the watering points. That is absolutely central to improved grazing management. We can't manage grazing if we don't have the water in the right places. And that's why it's so important to work with your NRCS or your extension agent or Bill Payne or another producer to make sure and take the time and get those watering points in the correct place. Not just for today, but for what you might want to do 3 or 4 years down the line. So if I want to maybe subdivide this pasture into 4 pieces in 4 years, I need to put that water in the center of that pasture so I can make that subdivision as my grazing management evolves. So we're managing two things that Ray talked about earlier this morning, how close that pasture's grazed, so that leaf area that's left after grazing. The more leaf area we leave, the more photosynthetic panel that grass has to grab that sunlight and produce sugars through photosynthesis. And then we're managing how long it's rested between grazing events. And that does two things. When we switch from a continuous to rotational stocking system, we'll see a 30 to 40% increase in pasture productivity. Not instantaneously, but over time as your system evolves. The other thing it does that we don't talk enough about is drought tolerance. What we do to the top of the plant impacts what's below the soil. So when I graze that pasture plant down to the soil surface continuously during the summer months, I'm not only impacting what's above the ground, but I'm making that root system smaller. And the smaller I make that root system, the more sensitive it's going to be to drought stress. When I have good grazing management, I've got a strong, healthy root system that's going to be able to find water when a plant that's been grazed very close can't find that water. So improved drought tolerance is one of the benefits of improved grazing management. The other thing that we didn't mention was improved nutrient cycles within grazing systems. The smaller I make my paddocks and the more frequently I move animals from paddock to paddock, the more uniform my distribution of dung and urine is within that grazing system. And that's important to have that good distribution, because we want to encourage a strong nutrient cycle within that grazing system, where the animals eat the forage and then about 80% to 90% of the nutrients come out the back end of the animal. We've got to manage those nutrients to benefit us in that grazing system. If they're depositing all those nutrients under a shade tree in the corner of a large pasture, we're not capitalizing on the value of those nutrients. And then we can use it to maintain and change botanical composition within grazing systems. When we change how close we graze a pasture, how frequently we graze that pasture, we'll see different species show up within that grazing system. So grazing management is really a powerful tool for impacting botanical composition within pastures. The last thing I want to mention is that sometimes we get so caught up in grazing management that we think we've got to move animals every 12 hours or every day, and that's not the case, right? So if I work a public job, I'm off the farm, and I can move animals on Sunday, then I set my grazing system up so I can move animals on Sunday. That system has to fit your wants and needs as a producer and as a person. The last thing I want to mention about grazing systems is that we need to build flexibility into that system, because we're going to have droughts and we're going to have floods and we're going to have ice storms. We've got to have flexibility within that system. And as our grazing management increases or improves over time, we'll want to manage more intensively, most likely. And so we need to think about that, not how we're going to manage that pasture tomorrow or 6 months, but how we're going to be managing it in 2 or 3 years down the line, and build that kind of flexibility, especially with the watering system, into the system. There's a great publication in here by Dr. Smith and co-authors on rotational grazing. It's in your grazing manual. And step 5, if we're going to overseed pastures or interseed pastures, then we need to choose forage species that are, number one, adapted to here. I know that sounds silly, but if you choose forage species that work out in Nebraska, chances are they're not going to work in Kentucky. So they've got to be regionally adapted. They've got to be adapted to the soils on your farm. Just because alfalfa is well adapted to this region, it's not adapted to every soil. So we need to make sure that we're choosing forage species that are appropriate to the soils that we have on your farm. And then we want to use good quality varieties. And this is kind of where our long-term variety testing program comes in. We harvest, I think, around 5,000 plots, variety plots a year. And that information is summarized by Gene Olson. And then we publish a long-term variety summary of Kentucky forage trials. Yes? Okay, so there is a copy of this in the back of the binder in section 16. And I'll just point out, I just wanted to show you how to use this real quick. Just, if we look here, These are all variety trials across here. This is for a given variety. For example, here we had a variety that was entered in 2 years. This number in the parentheses is the number of site years, and then this is the percentage, and this is percent, or the average. 100 would be the average for the trial. So if it's above 100, that means it's performing above average, and those are the varieties that we want you to choose. So in this example, this is 116. We've got 10 location years, so we feel pretty good about that number. We feel less good if it was only 2. And so it's performing 16% on average above the average of the trial. And then here's one for this is for white clover, I think. Yeah, for white clover, that's 71%. Huge difference in performance. So both of those are white clover, but one is certainly better adapted than the other one. And that's the one that we want to choose to incorporate into a grazing system. All right, step 6. So if we want to overseed our pastures or interseed our pastures, this is a pretty important step, and that's we've got to suppress that existing sod. So if we've got a good sod there or a sod that is kind of grown up, we want to get it grazed down so that we can get that seed in contact with the soil. For a seed to germinate, it's got to be in contact with the soil. This allows good soil to seed contact, reduces shading, and it's probably best accomplished with the animal. If we graze hard, harvest hay or clip, we can remove that dry matter, but grazing is probably the best to suppress that sod. The only time I'd ever tell you to abuse your pastures is right before you want to overseed them, because you want to reduce the vigor of that sod a little bit, open it up so that that seed can get in contact with the soil. And then get good soil to seed contact. And there's a whole bunch of different methods to seed with. We can use minimum tillage or no tillage or frost seed, and we'll talk about a couple of these. There's one that always comes up, and that's livestock seeding. That's when you put some seed in some mineral and you feed it to the animal, and you hope it comes out the back end and germinates and produces a viable seedling. People talk about that sometimes, but it's really not a viable method. So you're much better off to broadcast that seed or frost seed it than try to use livestock seeding. So just don't do that. Regardless of the seeding method, the goal is always the same. That's to get that seed in contact with the soil so it can germinate and produce a viable seedling. I want to talk about frost seeding because when you're just starting out, this is one of the things that you can do that's relatively inexpensive to do, and most of you can get over your pasture with an ATV or a UTV with a small spinner seeder on the back and broadcast seed out across that pasture. It's best done in late winter or early spring. Generally, mid-February is a good time to do it. And the freezing and the thawing causes little cracks to occur in the soil, and that's going to incorporate that seed into the soil. It works best with red and white clover, not as well with alfalfa and grasses. So red and white clover are really your go-to legumes, and it works well with those. And preparation, again, begins prior to actual frost seeding. We want to make sure if we have any really bad weed problems that we need a herbicide on, we can get those under control before we frost seed. What happens if we don't do that? What happens if we frost seed and we get a bunch of little clover seedlings and then we spray 2,4-D on them? We wasted our money, right? So we want to make sure that we have a good environment for those legumes to thrive in. That means taking a soil test and making sure that our pH is where it needs to be and our phosphorus and potassium are where they need to be. And then we want to make sure that we reduce residue prior to frost seeding. 5 minutes? Okay, we're coming towards the end, Ray. All right, so frost seeding success. Graze it close so you get rid of that residue. Make sure you get the seed on in plenty of time to have adequate freezing and thawing cycles. One of the keys to success with frost seeding is controlling competition after those seedlings germinate. So after the seed germinates and the sod starts to grow, the worst thing we can do is take the animals off. We want to leave the animals on to keep the sod grazed down. And you're worried, well, they're going to step on those seedlings or they may nip some off, and that's going to happen. But if we don't control that sod and that sod grows up around those tiny seedlings that barely have a root system started, they're going to shade those seedlings out and we'll lose all those seedlings. So leaving animals on until the seedlings get tall enough that a number of them are getting grazed off is a good practice to help those seedlings get started in that sod. Make sure we use high quality seed, the correct seeding rate, and get even seed distribution. Done some interesting work. Brittany's going to demonstrate a GPS unit at the research farm this afternoon. But this has really greatly increased the accuracy of frost seeding. We're 30 years behind the row crop guys, right? Row crop guys have been using light bars and GPS for row crop operations for 30 years. But some of these units have gotten fairly inexpensive now, and they can really improve the accuracy of not only seed distribution, but also fertilizer, broiler litter, lime, or even spraying pastures. Okay, somebody asked about no-till seeding, and I got a couple slides on no-till seeding. It takes a little bit more attention and effort, but it's actually putting that seed in contact with the soil. So we're not counting on freezing and thawing to get that seed in contact with the soil. So we can get fairly decent results if we do it right. Can be successful in the spring or fall. Best method for interseeding alfalfa. Again, it starts out by suppressing the sod and reducing residue so that we can get the seed into the soil. If we have a lot of residue, we can get hairpinning where it presses that residue down into the drill slit and makes kind of a basket and keeps the seed from being in good contact with the soil. We want to calibrate the drill prior to seeding. We've got a great video online and a nice publication on how to do that. It's very simple. You just follow these directions. We've done most of the math for you. You got to do one math problem when you use this particular method. There's a nice video on our website that was made by Ag Communications, and I'm not just saying that because I'm the star of the video, but this is really good, and it's universal across grain drills. So it's just not for a John Deere or a hay buster. You can use it on any grain drill. Check and recheck your seeding depth. The most common mistake made when we no-till is we put the seed too deep. So for most small seed forages, we don't want to be going deeper than ½ an inch. General rules, if you can't see a little bit of seed along the drill slit, then we're probably going too deep. So make sure you're checking it, and then control post-seeding competition. And that's my last step, is make sure you control that competition after that seed germinates and those little seedlings try to grow. And this is my checklist. Clip pastures to start off with, control problem weeds, soil test and adjust fertility as needed, implement rotational stocking, choose adapted forage species, and then overseed or interseed as needed. All right, I'm done. Is there any questions?